our side, as busy as they are, I mean, they helped us with everything to get this done. I just want you to know we appreciate it. One of the reasons for this project in the past, a lot of things that we were doing was basically putting together a list of all surveys and other projects we've used. We changed the delay law, which helped us a lot, but we've never really had a deep dive into exactly what the people in the town want from the Historical Commission, and also finding out what other towns are doing, and what also programs and funding that may be available to us. So this, what we're gonna see tonight, this is done over a year period. And one of the key things at the end is we're looking for some short and long-term goals that we can go forward to for the town to keep this moving ahead. Now that we know what's out there, we have some input from the people in town. We'll probably get more as we go along. But I think this is a new step going a completely different way than we've done it before. So with that, get questions.
All right, thank you all for coming again tonight. For those of you who were not with us last time, my name's Gretchen Pinio. I'm an architectural historian at the Public Archaeology Lab, and I've been working on this project with Jean and Janae and the Historical Commission to make a plan. So if you were not with us last time, I will give you kind of a quick overview of what the project has been, and then we'll get into the sort of real point of tonight's meeting, which is our recommendations. So the idea was to prepare a historic preservation plan that has actual meaningful things that you can do that would help move preservation forward in Sturbridge. And it was also to provide a community vision for preservation. What do the people in town want? What is feasible? What kinds of resources are here that you want to protect, that should be protected? And so we've given some guidance for that. And in putting all this together, we've also worked with Jennifer Doherty at the Massachusetts Historical Commission. She's the local programs coordinator. So she oversees all these sorts of programs. So our scope, what we were set out to do was to create a framework for implementation. So what that means is you should do thing X, here's how you do it. And it applies across a wide variety of preservation tools that we've identified that would be of use. So it was roughly a 5-step process. The first was to collect background information. We had a little bit of a leg up in 2018. PAL did a historic resources survey here in the town, so we were familiar with a lot of resources. Then we did some background research to understand parts of the town that we hadn't already surveyed. We had a public survey that was available in paper and online. We had about 79 responses, I think. And then we took all of that information, input from the Historical Commission and Jen Doherty and Jean and Janae and residents in the town, and we started to identify some of the challenges, some of what folks are concerned about for historic resources, and to try and figure out what steps need to be taken next to preserve those, to identify those, to document those. And so now we're at step 5, which is preparing the recommendations and compiling the final report. And so what we are producing is a report that will go to Jean and Janae and presumably will be available widely, that is meant to give about a 5 to 10 year roadmap. This is not the end all be all of everything that should ever be done. What we've really tried to do is prioritize. There's some longer range things. You could do them at the end of the 5-year thing or longer than that. And then there's some more really short-term things that we as preservationists think would be either useful or really important to do in order to move preservation forward. So step 1, collecting the background information. That was a fairly wide-ranging effort. We collected historic documentation that was done in the town planning, so the trail sustainability, master plans from the beginning of master planning here in Sturbridge in the 60s, documents that were prepared for when buildings were rehabilitated, when unfortunately maybe buildings were lost, like the Worcester South Agricultural Hall, to really get a full picture of Sturbridge's history. The next thing we did, a little more background research. So what you see on the right is an example of an inventory form. That's actually one that I did. And on the left, you'll see some historic photographs. Most of those came from a website called Digital Commonwealth, which is kind of a clearinghouse website. Historical commissions, historical societies, libraries, if they have historic photos, maps, the upper left is a mutual aid risk assessment map for the Fiskdale Mills. And so all of these are available online. Some you can download for free, some are covered by certain types of use licenses called the Creative Commons license, and some you have to go through the repository. So Historic New England has things there. The Boston Public Library has a massive collection there. And the library here in town has some of their collections up there. Next up was the public survey. And so as I said, it was available online through Google Forms and was available in hard copy, and we collated everything, regardless of how we got it submitted to us, it was digital or hard copy. And then we analyzed the information. We did some graphics to try and visually represent the information that we got. So question 9B, you'll see here at the top. What resources do you think tie into the town's historic character, help build the town's historic character? So you can see historic villages, very important. Historic corridors, a little bit less. Stone walls were really important. So that was one of the questions that we sort of, I don't want to say took the temperature, but we got a sense for what resources people in the town identify as being historical, being significant. And then question 10 is, what words or what resources do you think are historically significant? And we did a little word cloud. Everybody phrased it differently. It was a free response question. And so instead of trying to count how many times somebody said Town Common versus Old Sturbridge Village, we graphically represented it so you could get a sense. Town Common is one of the big important ones. So is Public House. Smaller ones though, cemeteries, trails, the Blackington Building or the Otis Building, the Otis Block. So then we started looking at historic preservation issues. And one of the biggest ones that we saw is the potential and actual loss of historic buildings. So as I think probably everybody remembers, the Worcester South Agricultural Society exhibition hall came down in 2016. And it was replaced with a CVS. Other buildings that are either at risk or have been lost, the Fiskdale Upper Mill on Holland Road, right as you come in from Brimfield, it's pretty front and center. And then the C.G. Allen House, which was demolished in 2017. So this is just sort of a cross-section. There are residences, there are industrial buildings that are tied to Sturbridge's industrial past that may be threatened. Other potential issues and challenges, identifying the short and long-term preservation goals, which is part of the plan. A volunteer shortage, sometimes it's hard to have enough volunteer hands to do all of the work that needs doing. Communication and coordination between the departments and commissions. Sturbridge has a wide variety of historic resources that are overseen by a wide variety of boards and organizations. And so sometimes it can be a little bit hard to get everybody talking to each other on the same page about things. So you've got the cemetery, and you've got stone walls, and you've got historic trees and buildings, and they're all overseen by different people. And then having a town-wide inventory of historic properties and archaeological sites. And so as you'll see up here, this is the current map of what has been documented in Sturbridge that is in the Massachusetts Cultural Resources Inventory System. We call it MACRIS for short. And so you'll see there are gaps up here at the top, a lot of gaps, down at the bottom, lots of gaps. And so there's more that needs to be done for a survey to understand all of the buildings and building types and development periods in Sturbridge's history. So before we could make a plan and identify next steps, we had to identify other types of resources or issues that might fall into categories that we look at while doing preservation. So the reuse and redevelopment of historic properties, and that falls under a couple things. It can be a house being rehabilitated. It can be an old house getting turned into a restaurant. I know there's several of those around. Or it can be mills getting redeveloped. So the Fiskdale Lower Mill has been redeveloped into shops. Potential impacts for new projects to historic resources. If they needed to widen the street, would that impact Town Hall? Would that impact the Town Common? Would that impact a historic stone wall or historic trees? The storage of historic town records and historical objects. So what we learned through talking to people, and we talked to folks in lots of different departments and organizations, is that Sturbridge's historical records are in a couple of places. So there's some here, there's some maybe at the library, there's some in the public safety complex. And so having a way to have everything together so that you know what's there, it's all climate controlled storage, so they'll last for a long time and be available to people for reference for a while. The lack of local historic districts. Some places don't worry about local historic districts. They are a preservation tool where you can dictate to an extent what can happen to a building or an area of buildings. This is not you can't tell me what color to paint my house. That is one of in the legislation that enables them, there are a series of things that you're not allowed to prescribe, and paint color is one of them. That's the one we hear most often as preservationists. This is not that. Other places, Nantucket does have one where they can prescribe paint color, but that's a different flavor of thing. But having local historic districts is a requirement to becoming a certified local government. And certified local governments are eligible for more grant funding from the state to do preservation projects. So every year, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts participates in the Survey and Planning Grant, which is what's paying this, and paid the survey that PAL did in 2018. The money comes from the National Park Service. It's administered by the Massachusetts Historical Commission, or MHC, and they have to give, I think it's 10%. They have to give a certain percentage every year to certified local governments, regardless of whatever else they're funding. So it's a good way to get funding. And there's just a few other, you report to the Park Service every year, all of your activities. So it's another thing that you can do. It's by no means a requirement, but a lot of cities and towns make use of it because you can have single building local historic districts. So you just want to save the Otis block. You're not worried about the little grocery store next to it or the houses next to it, but you want to do that building, you can do single building local historic districts. So historic properties and cemeteries management, again, just making sure that the people who oversee them are all in conversation with each other. There's a small building that's in the North Cemetery, so you just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page for that. And then generating awareness of and enthusiasm for historic resources. Sturbridge has a wealth of historic resources in the town, and making sure folks know what there is and want to see it preserved. So the last portion of this is we had to come up with some recommendations. What are some goals? What are some policies that should maybe be adopted? Generally speaking, the results from the survey, folks in town really do take pride in town history and in the resources and architecture that are here and do value their preservation. We did notice that resources that are associated with the recent past, so the last 50-ish years, are really in need of documentation before they are lost. So one of the things that can happen is if you have a building that is more than 50 years old, but less than 75 or 100. So it's within living memory. Often you don't think that that's historic. The National Park Service in the National Register program, if a building is at least 50 years old, it's potentially eligible for listing. 50 years ago was 1973. But you don't ever think about it. You're like, no, 50 years ago was like in the 40s, right? So all of the motels that were built in the 50s, the establishment of Old Sturbridge Village, sort of the tourist trade that came into town, that's all about that time period. And so understanding who built the motels on 131 and 20, and when were they built and why were they built and who stayed at them. All of that's really important to understanding Sturbridge's history. So our recommendations, if you grabbed the one sheet, this is sort of the Cliff's Notes version of what we're about to talk about. Our recommendations are divided into 4 categories. So there's inventory and survey, National Register documentation, education and outreach, and then bylaws and regulations. Our near-term projects are the 1 to 3 year timeframe. Longer-term projects are 3 to 5. And then ones that we classified as ongoing have either had previous phases completed or they don't have a finite ending. So those can be things like educating historical commission members when you have new members come on, making sure they know how the preservation laws work. MHC does a great series of webinars on that. But so it's meant to have, our recommendations have a variety of options that you can take. Some you may need a consultant to do, of an archaeologist or architectural historian. Others you can do without hiring a consultant or engaging the services of a professional. So inventory and survey. This takes several flavors. There's a historic survey plan. That can go 2 ways. You can have a historic survey plan writ large where you have a consultant come and help figure out a survey plan. A lot of what would be covered in that is in this historic preservation plan that we have already done. But the survey plans will have a little bit more context for certain areas and will recommend areas that needed to be surveyed. You can also lowercase historic survey plan. So just as a commission, as a town, what are the resources that you want to prioritize surveying? So it's not you've called a consultant to make you a plan, you just have a plan going forward so that you know next year we're going to talk to PVPC, ask them to do a survey, this is what we want them to do, and sort of have a checklist. Focused surveys are a little bit broader. And for those, it's, as I mentioned, resources associated with Sturbridge's tourist history, resources that are associated with particular ethnic groups that came into town or lived here. So talking to descendants of Irish folks who came in and worked in the mills, talking to the Nipmuc and finding out about where did they live in town, what was their experience living in Sturbridge. I talked to Ken White, he told me great stories that would be important to have recorded. Archaeological surveys, that's usually kind of a two-phase thing. You do need a professional archaeologist to come in and do that. And what they will do, they're not going to put a shovel in the ground, but they're going to look at historic maps and geology and things like that and figure out areas in town that are more or less archaeologically sensitive, so that you will want to be aware that if somebody wanted to build a 5-story building on Turner Field, right by the river, it's probably archaeologically sensitive, but you would want to know for sure before you let someone go down with a backhoe and dig up who knows what. So that's a lot of what that plan can do, is just help you understand the potential archaeological resources in town. Landscape survey. We heard from folks in the survey that historic landscapes are important. So the town common, agricultural fields, the ball field. It can take a lot of different angles, and it can be a lot of different resources. So a landscape survey to document those important landscapes. And then expanding the historic survey. So as I mentioned earlier, there are some gaps geographically in what has been surveyed or not that you would want to pick up and fill in. National Register. So there are a couple of National Register documented resources in town. Town Common District is one. We are in a National Register listed building right now. And then there's the Tantasqueeze Mine. I always say that wrong. I'm sure I did again. And then, what else is there? There's only a couple. But you would want, I think the house over by OSB, the White House.
Oliver White.
Yeah, that's also listed as an individual resource. So all of that documentation by and large is from the 1970s. The way we did National Register documentation then, which you'll see on the left, is very different from how we do it now. So you may consider updating that National Register documentation. The update would bring it up to current standards, so it makes it a more useful planning tool. It would also potentially expand areas of significance, period of significance. When we do updates, that frequently happens. You might tweak the boundaries a little bit. And then do new documentation. In the report and through the survey completion reports that we did and that the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission did in 2016, we both recommended several properties potentially eligible for listing in the National Register. So then if you wanted to go forward with that, then you would work with the Massachusetts Historical Commission, get their concurrence, and then move forward with an NR documentation. So education and outreach, you will see that this is the longest list. Laura and I both felt like this is maybe the most important piece of it. Documentation is great, but you really want to make resources available so people understand their history and are enthusiastic about preserving it. So we mentioned archival storage, storing the town's records, somewhere accessible, somewhere that is climate controlled so that they are preserved. But also encouraging others to find archival storage options for their materials. The Sturbridge Historical Society right now has things in boxes at the library. So trying to work together to find other places for things to be stored. Updating the website. I know that you guys redid it in 2017-ish.
Yeah, Janae did it.
But one of the things that we noticed through our work working with other cities and towns in the Commonwealth and taking a look for this project is there are websites for historical commissions and for towns that are much more robust and have a lot of information that's easily accessible for residents and visitors to be able to see and understand what's happening. One of the responses we got in the survey is we asked people to rate 1 to 5. How useful do you think the commission's website is in finding out about what's happening? And unfortunately, it was rated really quite low. And there are some places like Medford that have a shiny standalone website. There are other places like the town of Lexington that uses almost the exact same backend that you guys do. It looks very similar, but they've just put more information up. So in the final report, we give you like 4 or 5 places to take a look at that we've looked at. So public engagement takes a lot of different angles. It's having people come to historical commission meetings, like scheduling them when people are available to come in. It's having, again, your website have lots of information on it so that people do have access to it. And really getting people to get involved in preservation and in history in Sturbridge. It's not just what OSV has or does. Sturbridge has a historical life unto itself that should be celebrated and get people involved. So that could be through walking tours. You can do walking tours of the Common, walking tours of Fiskdale, different areas, so that people can either see parts of town that they're not as familiar with, maybe haven't thought about as much, or just drive through Fiskdale because I just want to get off this road. But, stop and walk around and see what's there. Doing history events, particularly with Old Sturbridge Village. There is a common sort of group of people that come in for those, and so you could do things in conjunction. Sponsor a lecture, co-sponsor a lecture that's hosted at OSB, but you have town representation there too. Interpretive signage and brochures. I know that there are brochure racks here at the Public House, across the street at the center office building, and in a few other places. Maybe trying to get those out a little bit wider, and really, if you develop walking tours, have fold-out brochures with those walking tours available there. I mentioned commissioner education. And so some of that's just going to the State Preservation Conference or attending other conferences. It's not Preservation Mass, there is a conference coming up next month that deals with things like disaster planning and engagement and walking tours and reinterpreting history and things like that. But there's also webinars that are through, if they're through the Preservation Mass group, they are available on YouTube or through their website, and they're free to watch. And then Jen Doherty runs webinars, I think about every other month, that you register for, and if you can't attend it, she'll send you the recording. So if you want to do local historic districts and you're not sure where to start, there's a webinar for that, and you can watch that and make sense of what that is. If you're interested in serving in the historical commission, but you don't really know what that means, or you want to know more about architecture in Massachusetts, there are webinars for all that sort of thing that you can watch or either live or a recording thereof to sort of understand a little bit more about what's there. And some of them are not meant for people who've done it for a while, because you know all that stuff. But then there might be others where you're like, I don't know anything about local historic districts. Maybe I'll do that one. So then community preservation and oral histories kind of go together. So community preservation, I know that there are folks in town who have fabulous collections of Sturbridge history. So working with them to preserve those, to find a repository for when they no longer wish to have those collections, taking up an entire room in their house or their basement. And then oral histories are really important to collect people's experiences. Living in town, I was sort of struck by this when COVID hit. We all went back to 1918 and started looking through diaries. There was nothing. Nobody talked about it. Nobody wrote diaries. Now we live in an age where you can blog it on your phone. But getting people's experiences, even for something like that, like what was it like being in a town when everything shut down? So that we know when this happens again in another 100 years, we know what people did. But also just understanding, people who've been in town their whole lives, or people who are recent. What are their experiences of Sturbridge? What drew them here? And what is their story? Bylaws and regulations, this is really sort of the last part of it. We already talked about local historic districts. So again, those are a preservation tool. Affirmative maintenance. This is also sometimes referred to as the demolition by neglect bylaw. Basically what it does is it asks people in town to make sure their buildings aren't becoming a safety hazard, and aren't being just left to fall down, because that's sometimes easier than having to shore up a roof that has a hole in it or a wall that's kind of leaning a little bit. And so the affirmative maintenance bylaw has language in it that insists that if you do not do certain things, then the town will board up the building for you. If there's a fire and there's windows and you just sort of go, I'm not doing anything with it, the town will then go in and board things up, make it safe. And then the protection of archaeological resources. MHC has sample bylaw language for this. It would feed out of having that archaeological sensitivity survey done. And then you can say areas that are rated as highly sensitive or highly likely to have archaeological resources, XYZ thing has to be done before you can build a house there, before you can put up a building of any sort, build a road through there, anything like that. And so that's when an archaeologist would have to get involved. So if you look at the one sheet that we had, all of those recommendations that I just sort of ran through are there. If you look at the top, though, the top 5 priorities, you'll see, again, we do really think that public engagement is the most important. And then having a plan for your historic survey, expanding that survey, and then archaeological survey, again, to understand what your archaeological history is, and then, archival storage. So at this point, if anybody has any questions or comments,
Anybody in the
So
audience?
please use the microphone if you do.
Larry?
Thank you for the presentation. Obviously, the historic dimension of the town is intrinsically valuable. It needs advocates. It's a commentary itself that it needs advocates. Yeah. Could you say something about the thrust of your approach? Is it possibly chiefly, as, for lack of a better word, an amenity of living here, or is it aimed as well or mainly as a commercial feature of the town through tourism and business development that comes that way? Or both, and if both, in what proportion, or something else altogether? And then just lastly, is there a centerpiece? In everybody, I think, in 5th grade or 7th grade, learns about the Schottern round the world, and you can go, and it was right here, and so forth. Is there a centerpiece, not necessarily as grand as Lexington Concord, that you have in mind here, or is it something else, the whole thing itself? Thank you.
thank you. So in terms of whether it's an amenity of living in Sturbridge or if it's a business sort of angle to look at preservation, it's a little bit of both. Old Sturbridge Village, I think, is a big draw, but I think Sturbridge as a town has its own draw. OSB is great, you can go to OSB, but there's so much more to see and explore. And so I think that's part of it, is bringing that forward. In terms of the history, honestly, my favorite story, it's a weird favorite story, but I've documented a fair few textile mills and the labor history in Sturbridge with the mill strikes in 1913 and Fiskdale are fascinating. Does anybody know that had happened? That's why history is important. That's why this needs to get done, because there's all these great stories that are lost, overlooked, forgotten. That shouldn't be.
I think one of the things we did, was it 2 years ago, when we did the thing for the cemetery, found out how many Revolutionary War people, getting back to Larry's question. There's a lot of people that we had a program last year that we found out that Hobbs was in the tea, throwing the tea over the boat, and he came from Sturbridge. So we're finding more and more people came from this town, and I guess the library has that now, of everyone who's buried in that.
Oh,
Down,
yes, that
So, I mean, there's a lot more that type of information that we're just starting to find out about, that we can really build stories on.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting stories. What I hadn't realized through my work, I documented a ton of properties in Roxbury. I started seeing names that were very familiar because Sturbridge was initially settled by folks from Medfield and Roxbury.
I mean, we just put I don't know if you saw the sign that was put up that Lafayette came to Sturbridge when he came back to the United States. And we just found out exactly where he came into town, and that's where we were able to put that up. So as we keep going through, that's what I'm saying, this is a different way. You know, initially we wanted to get a survey of everything, now we're trying to go to the next step.
Yep.
And
And that's what some of those like specific story
Right.
type surveys can do also. Who else in town was involved in the American Revolution? In what way? It wasn't just all men headed for the siege of Boston. What were the women in town doing? Were they rolling bandages? Were they making gunshot. We hear about
I
this
just
in other
have one other
places.
question, I guess in the final package, you'll probably, I looked at their local historical district. You're explaining all the benefit, that has to like go to town meeting and every,
Yes.
okay.
Yep, that's a
So that's
bylaw.
something we can talk, okay.
Yeah, that's a bylaw, so you can't
It's a
just
bylaw,
do it. Yeah.
okay. But in the final package, we'll know which websites to go on if it, and that's the one that you can do an individual
Yeah, so.
building if we wanted to, okay.
Yep, so some places will just do big districts. The city of Somerville does individual buildings. They have something like, I think last I knew, 328 local historic districts. Because they do individual buildings.
Okay.
So they do it a little bit differently. Some places, it's, if you find a little clutch of buildings you want to protect, that's maybe a good candidate for an LHD. Others, it's, an as needed. It can be reactive instead of proactive, which is
Okay.
sometimes a little
See
bit
that in the final, okay.
tricky, but.
I just wanted to compliment Wally, what he's doing on Facebook, because
Yes.
what he's doing is making people care about the, like you said, the story of our community and what these buildings mean to people back then, and it gives them value to the people living here now. So I want to thank you, Wally. I see that all the time, and I've learned so much about our community because of you. And I think that we want to encourage that coming from the Historical Commission.
Absolutely.
As you know, Wally's new on our commission.
pardon?
Yeah, he came up, 3-4 months ago.
I know.
And I
No,
mean,
but-
he is a wealth of information.
Yeah, so it's been very interesting, and like I said, I think it'll give to the community at large, they see it on Facebook, obviously, and it really does make a difference, because, a building's a building, but when it has a history about people,
Yep.
then it has meaning. Thank you.
You have anything? Charlie?
No, very good. No, I'm good.
No, I think we're, and I guess any individual, I think now with the demo delay law, as long as we handle things with all of the other, again, talking about communications with the other departments, we should never be in a situation where something's taken down without this board and the town knowing about it. So, I mean, I think that getting that change was the first big thing we did in the right direction, and it's probably something that should have been done a long time ago, but it's done. And I think because of what happened to the fairgrounds, more and more people are now interested in what we have and don't want to wind up losing something like that again.
Absolutely.
I believe educating the folks in town, and most people who grew up in town know a lot of the stories, and they know a lot of the history. And a lot of it was not really the behind-the-scenes things that weren't really taught or learned. And I think when you become attached to something like this building here, or the center office building across the street, or even the folks that are buried in the cemetery down the street there a bit, when you get to know this story a little bit more than just it's the cemetery, it's the old schoolhouse or whatever, you begin to become attached to it a little bit more. You begin to understand it a little bit more, and hopefully a lot more. We talked about the loss of the buildings here, like on Dowdy Road, the old house up there, and also the old Piccadilly, the old Worcester South agricultural building. We don't want to see those happen again. We don't. And the other thing to think about as well is not only the 18th and 19th century history that we have a lot of stuff that happened in the 20th century as well. And we think, you mentioned before, we don't think that from 1976 or 1954. Oh my God, it's the year I was born. And I'm a historic. But the thing is, you don't think of that line, but we can teach the people in town a little bit more about these things, become more attached to it, and you get more people interested in it, and you get that support. And storing things, and the archival things, and having a common place. I think we're on the way to getting there, and I think this plan.
I think this is a
gonna
good
help us.
start on it, too. And to get me, you're talking about oral histories, I've been in this town now 40 years, and it's only been in the last few years that I find out during World War II, everything that the training that was going on in the back
Yeah.
of Old Sturbridge Road. And anyone who's here knows that story. They actually practice bombing raids and everything else
Gosh.
back there. But my kids would never know that, and no one else would know it.
Right.
So you're right, there are things that don't have to go back that far, have a lot of history in them.
The plan is a good plan, I think.
Yeah, the other thing we really hope this plan would be a tool for the various boards and committees to understand what our historic assets really are and be able to reference that when projects come in or things,
Right.
are threatened to be changed, that there is a document to go to that people on these committees will be able to understand what the historic significance really is and what can be done to preserve as much of it as possible.
Okay, great. Well, I just wanted to add the library I think it was last year or the year before, received the grant to do the oral histories, and I know that, I mean, I've only been here for 18 years, and so I had a little interview, but a lot of people were interviewed, and I think if somebody had time to listen to some, maybe from more important people than me, but people who had been here, we might glean some more interesting information that would kind of take us in another path to, think about things a little differently. So I thought that was an interesting project. And I think all of that's on their website. And you can, it lists the name, and then you can listen to their interview. So,
And being a town planner for 18 years, you're certainly a very important.
well, thank you for saying that.
Very good.
And then I just want to say to everybody in this room, thank you very much for coming. And, when we have the final plan, we will put it on the website. We will put it out on the Sturbridge community page, the Facebook page. Wally, I'm sure, will blast it out on his as well, so that we can have that available to everybody. And also, we do still have one vacancy on the Historical Commission. So if you or anybody you know has an interest, then please apply to the town administrator, because we could, appreciate filling that seat, so.
Very good.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
And thank you to
And
Gretchen
thank you.
and Laura.
Oh, yeah, I
You just got here.
Sorry, I came in late, but I work with Gretchen at PAL and worked on the plan, Laura Klein, and Gretchen did obviously a great job with the presentation. But we both worked on the plan. We'll be pulling it together to get it into its final form. So any input that you have from after tonight, or that just if you have an idea about education, outreach, things that you think might be relevant to get in, you still have the chance. So you can send your comments to the town, and we'll be incorporating the final edits.
All right, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Well,
Do you close the meeting for me?
Oh, yeah, I do have to officially close at 7:15. Make a motion to close.
Second it.
All in favor? Yeah, I know, Butch Jackson was telling me about everything that happened.